Chapter 89 of the Count of Monte Cristo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by M.J. Frank. The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 89. A Nocturnal Interview. Monte Cristo waited, according to his usual custom, until Dupré had sung his famous Suivez-moi. Then he rose and went out. Morrel took leave of him at the door, renewing his promise to be with him the next morning at 7 o'clock, and to bring Emmanuel. Then he stepped into his coupe, calm and smiling, and was at home in 5 minutes. No one who knew the count could mistake his expression when, on entering, he said, "Ali, bring me my pistols with the ivory cross." Ali brought the box to his master, who examined the weapons with a solicitude very natural to a man who is about to entrust his life to a little powder and shot. These were pistols of an especial pattern, which Monte Cristo had had made for target practice in his own room. A cap was sufficient to drive out the bullet, and from the adjoining room no one would have suspected that the count was, as sportsmen would say, keeping his hand in. He was just taking one up and looking for the point to aim at on a little iron plate which served him as a target, when his study door opened and Baptistin entered. Before he had spoken a word, the count saw in the next room a veiled woman, who had followed closely after Baptistin, and now, seeing the count with the pistol in his hand and swords on the table, rushed in. Baptistin looked at his master, who made a sign to him, and he went out, closing the door after him. "Who are you, madame?" said the count to the veiled woman. The stranger cast one look around her to be certain that they were quite alone. Then, bending as if she would have knelt, and joining her hands, she said with an accent of despair, "Edmund, you will not kill my son?" The count retreated a step, uttered a slight exclamation, and let fall the pistol he held. "What name did you pronounce then, Madame de Morcerf?" said he. "Yours," cried she, throwing back her veil, "yours, which I alone, perhaps, have not forgotten. Edmund, it is not Madame de Morcerf who has come to you, it is Mercédès." "Mercédès is dead, madame," said Monte Cristo. "I know no one now of that name." "Mercédès lives, sir, and she remembers, for she alone recognized you when she saw you, and even before she saw you, by your voice, Edmund, by the simple sound of your voice, and from that moment she has followed your steps, watched you, feared you, and she needs not to inquire what hand has dealt the blow which now strikes M. de Morcerf." "Fernand, do you mean?" replied Monte Cristo with bitter irony. "Since we are recalling names, let us remember them all." Monte Cristo had pronounced the name of Fernand with such an expression of hatred that Mercédès felt a thrill of horror run through every vein. "You see, Edmund, I am not mistaken, and have cause to say, 'Spare my son.'" "And who told you, madame, that I have any hostile intentions against your son?" "No one, in truth, but a mother has twofold sight. I guessed all. I followed him this evening to the opera, and concealed in a parquet box have seen all." "If you have seen all, madame, you know that the son of Fernand has publicly insulted me," said Monte Cristo with awful calmness. "Oh, for pity's sake!" "You have seen that he would have thrown his glove in my face if Morrel, one of my friends, had not stopped him." "Listen to me. My son has also guessed who you are. He attributes his father's misfortunes to you." "Madame, you are mistaken. They are not misfortunes. It is a punishment. It is not I who strike M. de Morcerf. It is Providence which punishes him." "And why do you represent Providence?" cried Mercédès. "Why do you remember when it forgets? What are Yanina and its vizier to you, Edmond? What injury has Fernand Mondego done you in betraying Ali Tepelini?" "Ah, madame," replied Monte Cristo, "all this is an affair between the French captain and the daughter of Vasiliki. It does not concern me, you are right. And if I have sworn to revenge myself, it is not on the French captain or the Count of Morcerf, but on the fisherman Fernand, the husband of Mercédès the Catalane." "Ah, sir," cried the countess, "how terrible a vengeance for a fault which fatality made me commit! For I am the only culprit, Edmond, and if you owe revenge to anyone, it is to me, who had not fortitude to bear your absence and my solitude." "But," exclaimed Monte Cristo, "why was I absent, and why were you alone?" "Because you had been arrested, Edmond, and were a prisoner." "And why was I arrested? Why was I a prisoner?" "I do not know," said Mercédès. "You do not, madame; at least, I hope not. But I will tell you. I was arrested and became a prisoner because, under the arbor of La Réserve, the day before I was to marry you, a man named Danglars wrote this letter, which the fisherman Fernand himself posted." Monte Cristo went to a secretary, opened a drawer by a spring, from which he took a paper which had lost its original color, and the ink of which had become a rusty hue. This he placed in the hands of Mercédès. It was Danglars' letter to the king's attorney, which the Count of Monte Cristo, disguised as a clerk from the house of Thomson and French, had taken from the file against Edmond Dantès on the day he had paid the 200,000 francs to M. de Boville. Mercédès read with terror the following lines: "The king's attorney is informed by a friend to the throne and religion that one Edmond Dantès, second in command on board the Pharaon, this day arrived from Smyrna, after having touched at Naples and Porto Ferrajo, is the bearer of a letter from Murat to the usurper, and of another letter from the usurper to the Bonapartist Club in Paris. Ample corroboration of this statement may be obtained by arresting the above-mentioned Edmond Dantès, who either carries the letter for Paris about with him, or has it at his father's abode. Should it not be found in the possession of either father or son, then it will assuredly be discovered in the cabin belonging to the said Dantès on board the Pharaon." "How dreadful!" said Mercédès, passing her hand across her brow, moist with perspiration. "And that letter?" "I bought it for 200,000 francs, madame," said Monte Cristo; "but that is a trifle, since it enables me to justify myself to you." "And the result of that letter?" "You well know, madame, was my arrest. But you do not know how long that arrest lasted. You do not know that I remained for 14 years within a quarter of a league of you, in a dungeon in the Château d'If. You do not know that every day of those 14 years I renewed the vow of vengeance which I had made the first day, and yet I was not aware that you had married Fernand, my calumniator, and that my father had died of hunger." "Can it be?" cried Mercédès, shuddering. "That is what I heard on leaving my prison 14 years after I had entered it, and that is why, on account of the living Mercédès and my deceased father, I have sworn to revenge myself on Fernand, and I have revenged myself." "And you are sure the unhappy Fernand did that?" "I am satisfied, madame, that he did what I have told you. Besides, that is not much more odious than that a Frenchman by adoption should pass over to the English, that a Spaniard by birth should have fought against the Spaniards, that a stipendiary of Ali should have betrayed and murdered Ali. Compared with such things, what is the letter you have just read? A lover's deception, which the woman who has married that man ought certainly to forgive, but not so the lover who was to have married her. Well, the French did not avenge themselves on the traitor, the Spaniards did not shoot the traitor, Ali in his tomb left the traitor unpunished. But I, betrayed, sacrificed, buried, have risen from my tomb, by the grace of God, to punish that man. He sends me for that purpose, and here I am." The poor woman's head and arms fell, her legs bent under her, and she fell on her knees. "Forgive, Edmond, forgive for my sake, who love you still." The dignity of the wife checked the fervor of the lover and the mother. Her forehead almost touched the carpet when the count sprang forward and raised her. Then, seated on a chair, she looked at the manly countenance of Monte Cristo, on which grief and hatred still impressed a threatening expression. "Not crush that accursed race," murmured he, "abandon my purpose at the moment of its accomplishment? Impossible, madame, impossible." "Edmond," said the poor mother, who tried every means, "when I call you Edmond, why do you not call me Mercédès?" "Mercédès," repeated Monte Cristo. "Mercédès. Well, yes, you are right. That name has still its charms, and this is the first time for a long period that I have pronounced it so distinctly. Oh, Mercédès, I have uttered your name with the sigh of melancholy, with the groan of sorrow, with the last effort of despair. I have uttered it when frozen with cold, crouched on the straw in my dungeon. I have uttered it consumed with heat, rolling on the stone floor of my prison. Mercédès, I must revenge myself, for I suffered 14 years. 14 years I wept, I cursed. Now I tell you, Mercédès, I must revenge myself." The count, fearing to yield to the entreaties of her he had so ardently loved, called his sufferings to the assistance of his hatred. "Revenge yourself, then, Edmond," cried the poor mother, "but let your vengeance fall on the culprits, on him, on me, but not on my son." "It is written in the good book," said Monte Cristo, "that the sins of the fathers shall fall upon their children to the third and fourth generation. Since God himself dictated those words to his prophet, why should I seek to make myself better than God?" "Edmond," continued Mercédès, with her arms extended towards the count, "since I first knew you I have adored your name, have respected your memory. Edmond, my friend, do not compel me to tarnish that noble and pure image reflected incessantly on the mirror of my heart. Edmond, if you knew all the prayers I have addressed to God for you while I thought you were living, and since I have thought you must be dead. Yes, dead, alas! I imagined your dead body buried at the foot of some gloomy tower, or cast to the bottom of a pit by hateful jailers, and I wept. What could I do for you, Edmund, besides pray and weep? Listen, for 10 years I dreamed each night the same dream. I had been told that you had endeavored to escape, that you had taken the place of another prisoner, that you had slipped into the winding sheet of a dead body, that you had been thrown alive from the top of the Château d'If, and that the cry you uttered as you dashed upon the rocks first revealed to your jailers that they were your murderers. Well, Edmund, I swear to you by the head of that son for whom I entreat your pity, Edmund, for 10 years I saw every night every detail of that frightful tragedy, and for 10 years I heard every night the cry which awoke me shuddering and cold, and I too, Edmund, oh, believe me, guilty as I was, oh, yes, I too have suffered much." "Have you known what it is to have your father starved to death in your absence?" cried Monte Cristo, thrusting his hands into his hair. "Have you seen the woman you loved giving her hand to your rival while you were perishing at the bottom of a dungeon?" "No," interrupted Mercédès, "but I have seen him whom I loved on the point of murdering my son." Mercédès uttered these words with such deep anguish, with an accent of such intense despair, that Monte Cristo could not restrain a sob. The lion was daunted, the avenger was conquered. "What do you ask of me?" said he. "Your son's life? Well, he shall live." Mercédès uttered a cry which made the tears start from Monte Cristo's eyes, but these tears disappeared almost instantaneously, for doubtless God had sent some angel to collect them. Far more precious were they in his eyes than the richest pearls of Guzerat and Ophir. "Oh," said she, seizing the count's hand and raising it to her lips, "oh, thank you, Edmund. Now you are exactly what I dreamt you were, the man I always loved. Oh, now I may say so." "So much the better," replied Monte Cristo, "as that poor Edmund will not have long to be loved by you. Death is about to return to the tomb, the phantom to retire in darkness." "What do you say, Edmund?" "I say, since you command me, Mercédès, I must die." "Die? And why so? Who talks of dying? Whence have you these ideas of death?" "You do not suppose that publicly outraged in the face of a whole theatre, in the presence of your friends and those of your son, challenged by a boy who will glory in my forgiveness as if it were a victory, you do not suppose that I can for one moment wish to live? What I most loved after you, Mercédès, was myself, my dignity, and that strength which rendered me superior to other men, that strength was my life. With one word you have crushed it, and I die." "But the duel will not take place, Edmund, since you forgive." "It will take place," said Monte Cristo in a most solemn tone; "but instead of your son's blood to stain the ground, mine will flow." Mercédès shrieked and sprang towards Monte Cristo, but suddenly stopping, "Edmund," said she, "there is a God above us, since you live and since I have seen you again. I trust to him from my heart. While waiting his assistance, I trust to your word. You have said that my son should live, have you not?" "Yes, madam, he shall live," said Monte Cristo, surprised that without more emotion Mercédès had accepted the heroic sacrifice he made for her. Mercédès extended her hand to the count. "Edmond," said she, and her eyes were wet with tears while looking at him to whom she spoke, "how noble it is of you, how great the action you have just performed, how sublime to have taken pity on a poor woman who appealed to you with every chance against her. Alas, I am grown old with grief more than with years, and cannot now remind my Edmond by a smile or by a look of that Mercédès whom he once spent so many hours in contemplating. Ah, believe me, Edmond, as I told you, I too have suffered much. I repeat, it is melancholy to pass one's life without having one joy to recall, without preserving a single hope. But that proves that all is not yet over. No, it is not finished. I feel it by what remains in my heart. Oh, I repeat it, Edmond, what you have just done is beautiful, it is grand, it is sublime. Do you say so now, Mercédès? Then what would you say if you knew the extent of the sacrifice I make to you? Suppose that the Supreme Being, after having created the world and fertilized chaos, had paused in the work to spare an angel the tears that might one day flow for mortal sins from her immortal eyes. Suppose that when everything was in readiness, and the moment had come for God to look upon his work and see that it was good, suppose he had snuffed out the sun and tossed the world back into eternal night. Then, even then, Mercédès, you could not imagine what I lose in sacrificing my life at this moment." Mercédès looked at the count in a way which expressed at the same time her astonishment, her admiration, and her gratitude. Monte Cristo pressed his forehead on his burning hands, as if his brain could no longer bear alone the weight of his thoughts. "Edmond," said Mercédès, "I have but one word more to say to you." The count smiled bitterly. "Edmond," continued she, "you will see that if my face is pale, if my eyes are dull, if my beauty is gone, if Mercédès, in short, no longer resembles her former self in her features, you will see that her heart is still the same. Adieu, then, Edmond. I have nothing more to ask of heaven. I have seen you again, and have found you as noble and as great as formerly you were. Adieu, Edmond, adieu, and thank you." But the count did not answer. Mercédès opened the door of the study and had disappeared before he had recovered from the painful and profound reverie into which his thwarted vengeance had plunged him. The clock of the Invalides struck 1 when the carriage which conveyed Madame de Morcerf away rolled on the pavement of the Champs Élysées, and made Monte Cristo raise his head. "What a fool I was," said he, "not to tear my heart out on the day when I resolved to avenge myself." Chapter 89. Recording by M.J. Frank, Portland, Oregon.
Of the Count of Monte Cristo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 90. The Meeting. After Mercédès had left Monte Cristo, he fell into profound gloom. Around him and within him the flight of thought seemed to have stopped. His energetic mind slumbered, as the body does after extreme fatigue. "What," said he to himself, while the lamp and the wax lights were nearly burnt out, and the servants were waiting impatiently in the anteroom—"what this edifice which I have been so long preparing, which I have reared with so much care and toil, is to be crushed by a single touch, a word, a breath? Yes, this self, of whom I thought so much, of whom I was so proud, who had appeared so worthless in the dungeons of the Château d'If, and whom I had succeeded in making so great, will be but a lump of clay tomorrow. Alas, it is not the death of the body I regret, for is not the destruction of the vital principle, the repose to which everything is tending, to which every unhappy being aspires, is not this the repose of matter after which I so long sighed, and which I was seeking to attain by the painful process of starvation, when Faria appeared in my dungeon? What is death for me? One step farther into rest, two, perhaps, into silence. No, it is not existence, then, that I regret, but the ruin of projects so slowly carried out, so laboriously framed. Providence is now opposed to them when I most thought it would be propitious. It is not God's will that they should be accomplished. This burden, almost as heavy as a world, which I had raised, and I had thought to bear to the end, was too great for my strength, and I was compelled to lay it down in the middle of my career. Oh, shall I then again become a fatalist, whom 14 years of despair and 10 of hope had rendered a believer in Providence? And all this because my heart, which I thought dead, was only sleeping, because it has awakened and has begun to beat again, because I have yielded to the pain of the emotion excited in my breast by a woman's voice. Yet," continued the count, becoming each moment more absorbed in the anticipation of the dreadful sacrifice for the morrow which Mercédès had accepted, "yet it is impossible that so noble-minded a woman should thus through selfishness consent to my death when I am in the prime of life and strength. It is impossible that she can carry to such a point maternal love, or rather delirium. There are virtues which become crimes by exaggeration. No, she must have conceived some pathetic scene. She will come and throw herself between us, and what would be sublime here will there appear ridiculous." The blush of pride mounted to the count's forehead as this thought passed through his mind. "Ridiculous?" repeated he, "and the ridicule will fall on me. I ridiculous? No, I would rather die." By thus exaggerating to his own mind the anticipated ill fortune of the next day, to which he had condemned himself by promising Mercédès to spare her son, the count at last exclaimed, "Folly, folly, folly! To carry generosity so far as to put myself up as a mark for that young man to aim at! He will never believe that my death was suicide. And yet it is important for the honor of my memory, and this surely is not vanity, but a justifiable pride. It is important the world should know that I have consented, by my free will, to stop my arm, already raised to strike, and that with the arm which has been so powerful against others, I have struck myself. It must be. It shall be." Seizing a pen, he drew a paper from a secret drawer in his desk, and wrote at the bottom of the document, which was no other than his will, made since his arrival in Paris, a sort of codicil clearly explaining the nature of his death. "I do this, O my God," said he, with his eyes raised to heaven, "as much for thy honor as for mine. I have during 10 years considered myself the agent of thy vengeance, and other wretches, like Morcerf, Danglars, Villefort, even Morcerf himself, must not imagine that chance has freed them from their enemy. Let them know, on the contrary, that their punishment, which had been decreed by Providence, is only delayed by my present determination, and although they escape it in this world, it awaits them in another, and that they are only exchanging time for eternity." While he was thus agitated by gloomy uncertainties, wretched waking dreams of grief, the first rays of morning pierced his windows, and shone upon the pale blue paper upon which he had just inscribed his justification of Providence. It was just 5 o'clock in the morning, when a slight noise like a stifled sigh reached his ear. He turned his head, looked around him, and saw no one; but the sound was repeated distinctly enough to convince him of its reality. He arose, and quietly opening the door of the drawing room, saw Haydée, who had fallen on a chair, with her arms hanging down and her beautiful head thrown back. She had been standing at the door, to prevent his going out without seeing her, until sleep, which the young cannot resist, had overpowered her frame, wearied as she was with watching. The noise of the door did not awaken her, and Monte Cristo gazed at her with affectionate regret. "She remembered that she had a son," said he, "and I forgot I had a daughter." Then, shaking his head sorrowfully, "Poor Haydée," said he, "she wished to see me, to speak to me. She has feared or guessed something. Oh, I cannot go without taking leave of her. I cannot die without confiding her to someone." He quietly regained his seat, and wrote under the other lines: "I bequeath to Maximilian Morrel, captain of Spice, and son of my former patron, Pierre Morrel, shipowner at Marseilles, the sum of 20 millions, a part of which may be offered to his sister Julia and brother-in-law Emmanuel, if he does not fear this increase of fortune may mar their happiness. These 20 millions are concealed in my grotto at Monte Cristo, of which Bertuccio knows the secret. If his heart is free, and he will marry Haydée, the daughter of Ali Pasha of Yanina, whom I have brought up with the love of a father, and who has shown the love and tenderness of a daughter for me, he will thus accomplish my last wish. This will has already constituted Haydée heiress of the rest of my fortune, consisting of lands, funds in England, Austria, and Holland, furniture in my different palaces and houses, and which without the 20 millions and the legacies to my servants may still amount to 60 millions. He was finishing the last line when a cry behind him made him start, and the pen fell from his hand. "Haydée," he said, "did you read it?" "Oh, my lord," said she, "why are you writing thus at such an hour? Why are you bequeathing all your fortune to me? Are you going to leave me?" "I am going on a journey, dear child," said Monte Cristo with an expression of infinite tenderness and melancholy, "and if any misfortune should happen to me——" The count stopped. "Well?" asked the young girl, with an authoritative tone the count had never observed before, and which startled him. "Well, if any misfortune happen to me," replied Monte Cristo, "I wish my daughter to be happy." Haydée smiled sorrowfully, and shook her head. "Do you think of dying, my lord?" said she. "The wise man, my child, has said it is good to think of death." "Well, if you die," said she, "bequeath your fortune to others, for if you die I shall require nothing." And taking the paper, she tore it in 4 pieces, and threw it into the middle of the room. Then, the effort having exhausted her strength, she fell, not asleep this time, but fainting on the floor. The count leaned over her, and raised her in his arms, and seeing that sweet pale face, those lovely eyes closed, that beautiful form motionless, and to all appearance lifeless, the idea occurred to him for the first time that perhaps she loved him otherwise than as a daughter loves a father. "Alas," murmured he, with intense suffering, "I might, then, have been happy yet." Then he carried Haydée to her room, resigned her to the care of her attendants, and returning to his study, which he shut quickly this time, he again copied the destroyed will. As he was finishing, the sound of a cabriolet entering the yard was heard. Monte Cristo approached the window and saw Maximilian and Emmanuel alight. "Good," said he, "it was time." And he sealed his will with 3 seals. A moment afterwards he heard a noise in the drawing-room, and went to open the door himself. Morrel was there. He had come 20 minutes before the time appointed. "I am perhaps come too soon, count," said he, "but I frankly acknowledge that I have not closed my eyes all night, nor has anyone in my house. I need to see you strong in your courageous assurance to recover myself." Monte Cristo could not resist this proof of affection. He not only extended his hand to the young man, but flew to him with open arms. "Morrel," said he, "it is a happy day for me to feel that I am beloved by such a man as you. Good morning, Emmanuel. You will come with me, then, Maximilian?" "Did you doubt it?" said the young captain. "But if I were wrong?" "I watched you during the whole scene of that challenge yesterday. I have been thinking of your firmness all night, and I said to myself that justice must be on your side, or man's countenance is no longer to be relied on." "But, Morrel, Albert is your friend?" "Simply an acquaintance, sir." "You met on the same day you first saw me." "Yes, that is true, but I should not have recollected it if you had not reminded me." "Thank you, Morrel." Then, ringing the bell once, "Look," he said to Ali, who came immediately, "take that to my solicitor. It is my will, Morrel. When I am dead, you will go and examine it." "What," said Morrel, "you dead?" "Yes. Must I not be prepared for everything, dear friend? But what did you do yesterday after you left me?" "I went to Tortoni's, where, as I expected, I found Beauchamp and Château Renaud. I own I was seeking them." "Why, when all was arranged?" "Listen, count, the affair is serious and unavoidable." "Did you doubt it?" "No, the offence was public, and everyone is already talking of it." "Well?" "Well, I hoped to get an exchange of arms, to substitute the sword for the pistol. The pistol is blind." "Have you succeeded?" asked Monte Cristo quickly, with an imperceptible gleam of hope. "No, for your skill with the sword is so well known." "Ah, who has betrayed me?" "The skillful swordsman whom you have conquered." "And you failed?" "They positively refused." "Morrel," said the count, "have you ever seen me fire a pistol?" "Never." "Well, we have time. Look." Monte Cristo took the pistols he held in his hand when Mercédès entered, and fixing an ace of clubs against the iron plate, with 4 shots he successively shot off the 4 sides of the club. At each shot Morrel turned pale. He examined the bullets with which Monte Cristo performed this dexterous feat, and saw that they were no larger than buckshot. "It is astonishing," said he. "Look, Emmanuel." Then turning towards Monte Cristo, "Count," said he, "in the name of all that is dear to you, I entreat you not to kill Albert. The unhappy youth has a mother." "You are right," said Monte Cristo, "and I have none." These words were uttered in a tone which made Morrel shudder. "You are the offended party, count." "Doubtless. What does that imply?" "That you will fire first." "I fire first?" "Oh, I obtained, or rather claimed that. We had conceded enough for them to yield us that." "And at what distance?" 20 paces." A smile of terrible import passed over the count's lips. "Morrel," said he, "do not forget what you have just seen." "The only chance for Albert's safety, then, will arise from your emotion." "I suffer from emotion?" said Monte Cristo. "Or from your generosity, my friend. To so good a marksman as you are, I may say what would appear absurd to another." "What is that?" "Break his arm, wound him, but do not kill him." "I will tell you, Morrel," said the count, "that I do not need entreating to spare the life of M. de Morcerf. He shall be so well spared that he will return quietly with his 2 friends, while I——" "And you?" "That will be another thing. I shall be brought home." "No, no," cried Maximilian, quite unable to restrain his feelings. "As I told you, my dear Morrel, M. de Morcerf will kill me." Morrel looked at him in utter amazement. "But what has happened, then, since last evening, count?" "The same thing that happened to Brutus the night before the battle of Philippi. I have seen a ghost." "And that ghost——" "Told me, Morrel, that I had lived long enough." Maximilian and Emmanuel looked at each other. Monte Cristo drew out his watch. "Let us go," said he. "It is 5 minutes past 7, and the appointment was for 8 o'clock." A carriage was in readiness at the door. Monte Cristo stepped into it with his 2 friends. He had stopped a moment in the passage to listen at a door, and Maximilian and Emmanuel, who had considerately passed forward a few steps, thought they heard him answer by a sigh to a sob from within. As the clock struck 8, they drove up to the place of meeting. "We are first," said Morrel, looking out of the window. "Excuse me, sir," said Baptistin, who had followed his master with indescribable terror, "but I think I see a carriage down there under the trees." Monte Cristo sprang lightly from the carriage, and offered his hand to assist Emmanuel and Maximilian. The latter retained the count's hand between his. "I like," said he, "to feel a hand like this, when its owner relies on the goodness of his cause." "It seems to me," said Emmanuel, "that I see 2 young men down there, who are evidently waiting." Monte Cristo drew Morrel a step or 2 behind his brother-in-law. "Maximilian," said he, "are your affections disengaged?" Morrel looked at Monte Cristo with astonishment. "I do not seek your confidence, my dear friend, I only ask you a simple question. Answer it, that is all I require." "I love a young girl, count." "Do you love her much?" "More than my life." "Another hope defeated," said the count; then, with a sigh, "Poor Haydée," murmured he. "To tell the truth, count, if I knew less of you, I should think that you were less brave than you are." "Because I sigh when thinking of someone I am leaving? Come, Morrel, it is not like a soldier to be so bad a judge of courage. Do I regret life? What is it to me, who have passed 20 years between life and death? Moreover, do not alarm yourself, Morrel. This weakness, if it is such, is betrayed to you alone. I know the world is a drawing-room, from which we must retire politely and honestly, that is, with a bow, and our debts of honor paid." "That is to the purpose. Have you brought your arms?" "I? What for? I hope these gentlemen have theirs." "I will inquire," said Morrel. "Do but make no treaty, you understand me?" "You need not fear. Morrel advanced towards Beauchamp and Château Renaud, who, seeing his intention, came to meet him. The three young men bowed to each other courteously, if not affably. "Excuse me, gentlemen," said Morrel, "but I do not see M. de Morcerf." "He sent us word this morning," replied Château Renaud, "that he would meet us on the ground." "Ah," said Morrel. Beauchamp pulled out his watch. "It is only 5 minutes past 8," said he to Morrel; "there is not much time lost yet." "Oh, I made no allusion of that kind," replied Morrel. "There is a carriage coming," said Château Renaud. It advanced rapidly along one of the avenues leading toward the open space where they were assembled. "You are doubtless provided with pistols, gentlemen. M. de Monte Cristo yields his right of using his." "We had anticipated this kindness on the part of the count," said Beauchamp, "and I have brought some weapons which I bought 8 or 10 days since, thinking to want them on a similar occasion. They are quite new, and have not yet been used. Will you examine them?" "Oh, Monsieur Beauchamp, if you assure me that M. de Morcerf does not know these pistols, you may readily believe that your word will be quite sufficient." "Gentlemen," said Château Renaud, "it is not Morcerf coming in that carriage; faith, it is Franz and Debray." The two young men he announced were indeed approaching. "What chance brings you here, gentlemen?" said Château Renaud, shaking hands with each of them. "Because," said Debray, "Albert sent this morning to request us to come." Beauchamp and Château Renaud exchanged looks of astonishment. "I think I understand his reason," said Morrel. "What is it?" "Yesterday afternoon I received a letter from M. de Morcerf, begging me to attend the opera." "And I," said Debray. "And I also," said Franz. "And we too," added Beauchamp and Château Renaud. "Having wished you all to witness the challenge, he now wishes you to be present at the combat." "Exactly so," said the young men; "you have probably guessed right." "But after all these arrangements, he does not come himself," said Château Renaud. "Albert is 10 minutes after time." "There he comes," said Beauchamp, "on horseback, at full gallop, followed by a servant." "How imprudent," said Château Renaud, "to come on horseback to fight a duel with pistols, after all the instructions I had given him." "And besides," said Beauchamp, "with a collar above his cravat, an open coat, and white waistcoat. Why has he not painted a spot upon his heart? It would have been more simple." Meanwhile Albert had arrived within 10 paces of the group formed by the 5 young men. He jumped from his horse, threw the bridle on his servant's arms, and joined them. He was pale, and his eyes were red and swollen. It was evident that he had not slept. A shade of melancholy gravity overspread his countenance, which was not natural to him. "I thank you, gentlemen," said he, "for having complied with my request. I feel extremely grateful for this mark of friendship." Morrel had stepped back as Morcerf approached, and remained at a short distance. "And to you also, Monsieur Morrel, my thanks are due. Come, there cannot be too many." "Sir," said Maximilian, "you are not perhaps aware that I am M. de Monte Cristo's friend?" "I was not sure, but I thought it might be so. So much the better. The more honorable men there are here, the better I shall be satisfied." "Monsieur Morrel," said Château Renaud, "will you apprise the Count of Monte Cristo that M. de Morcerf is arrived, and we are at his disposal." Morrel was preparing to fulfill his commission. Beauchamp had meanwhile drawn the box of pistols from the carriage. "Stop, gentlemen," said Albert; "I have 2 words to say to the Count of Monte Cristo." "In private?" asked Morrel. "No, sir, before all who are here." Albert's witnesses looked at each other. Franz and Debray exchanged some words in a whisper, and Morrel, rejoiced at this unexpected incident, went to fetch the count, who was walking in a retired path with Emmanuel. "What does he want with me?" said Monte Cristo. "I do not know, but he wishes to speak to you." "Ah," said Monte Cristo, "I trust he is not going to tempt me by some fresh insult." "I do not think that such is his intention," said Morrel. The count advanced, accompanied by Maximilian and Emmanuel. His calm and serene look formed a singular contrast to Albert's grief-stricken face, who approached also, followed by the other 4 young men. When at 3 paces distant from each other, Albert and the count stopped. "Approach, gentlemen," said Albert. "I wish you not to lose one word of what I am about to have the honor of saying to the Count of Monte Cristo, for it must be repeated by you to all who will listen to it, strange as it may appear to you." "Proceed, sir," said the count. "Sir," said Albert, at first with a tremulous voice, but which gradually became firmer, "I reproached you with exposing the conduct of M. de Morcerf in Epirus, for guilty as I knew he was, I thought you had no right to punish him, but I have since learned that you had that right. It is not Fernand Mondego's treachery toward Ali Pasha which induces me so readily to excuse you, but the treachery of the fisherman Fernand towards you, and the almost unheard of miseries which were its consequences. And I say, and proclaim it publicly, that you were justified in revenging yourself on my father, and I, his son, thank you for not using greater severity." Had a thunderbolt fallen in the midst of the spectators of this unexpected scene, it would not have surprised them more than did Albert's declaration. As for Monte Cristo, his eyes slowly rose toward heaven with an expression of infinite gratitude. He could not understand how Albert's fiery nature, of which he had seen so much among the Roman bandits, had suddenly stooped to this humiliation. He recognized the influence of Mercédès, and saw why her noble heart had not opposed the sacrifice she knew beforehand would be useless. "Now, sir," said Albert, "if you think my apology sufficient, pray give me your hand. Next to the merit of infallibility which you appear to possess, I rank that of candidly acknowledging a fault. But this confession concerns me only. I acted well as a man, but you have acted better than man. An angel alone could have saved one of us from death. That angel came from heaven, if not to make us friends, which, alas, fatality renders impossible, at least to make us esteem each other." Monte Cristo, with moistened eye, heaving breast, and lips half open, extended to Albert a hand which the latter pressed with a sentiment resembling respectful fear. "Gentlemen," said he, "M. de Monte Cristo receives my apology. I had acted hastily towards him. Hasty actions are generally bad ones. Now my fault is repaired. I hope the world will not call me cowardly for acting as my conscience dictated. But if any one should entertain a false opinion of me," added he, drawing himself up as if he would challenge both friends and enemies, "I shall endeavor to correct his mistake." "What happened during the night?" asked Beauchamp of Château. "We appear to make a very sorry figure here." "In truth, what Albert has just done is either very despicable or very noble," replied the baron. "What can it mean?" said Debray to Franz. "The Count of Monte Cristo acts dishonorably to M. de Morcerf, and is justified by his son. Had I 10 Yaninas in my family, I should only consider myself the more bound to fight 10 times." As for Monte Cristo, his head was bent down, his arms were powerless. Bowing under the weight of 24 years' reminiscences, he thought not of Albert, of Beauchamp, of Château Renaud, or of any of that group, But he thought of that courageous woman who had come to plead for her son's life, to whom he had offered his, and who had now saved it by the revelation of a dreadful family secret, capable of destroying for ever in that young man's heart every feeling of filial piety. "Providence still," murmured he. "Now only am I fully convinced of being the emissary of God." Chapter 90.
One of the Count of Monte Cristo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 91. Mother and Son. The Count of Monte Cristo bowed to the 5 young men with a melancholy and dignified smile, and got into his carriage with Maximilian and Emmanuel. Albert, Beauchamp, and Château Renaud remained alone. Albert looked at his 2 friends, not timidly, but in a way that appeared to ask their opinion of what he had just done. "Indeed, my dear friend," said Beauchamp first, who had either the most feeling or the least dissimulation, "allow me to congratulate you. This is a very unhoped-for conclusion of a very disagreeable affair." Albert remained silent and wrapped in thought. Château Renaud contented himself with tapping his boot with his flexible cane. "Are we not going?" said he, after this embarrassing silence. "When you please," replied Beauchamp. "Allow me only to compliment M. de Morcerf, who has given proof to-day of rare chivalric generosity." "Oh, yes," said Château Renaud. "It is magnificent," continued Beauchamp, "to be able to exercise so much self-control." "Assuredly. As for me, I should have been incapable of it," said Château Renaud, with most significant coolness. "Gentlemen," interrupted Albert, "I think you did not understand that something very serious had passed between M. de Monte Cristo and myself." "Possibly, possibly," said Beauchamp immediately, "but every simpleton would not be able to understand your heroism, and sooner or later you will find yourself compelled to explain it to them more energetically than would be convenient to your bodily health and the duration of your life. May I give you a friendly counsel? Set out for Naples, The Hague, or St. Petersburg, calm countries, where the point of honor is better understood than among our hot-headed Parisians. Seek quietude and oblivion, so that you may return peaceably to France after a few years. Am I not right, Monsieur de Château Renaud?" "That is quite my opinion," said the gentleman. "Nothing induces serious duels so much as a duel forsworn." "Thank you, gentlemen," replied Albert, with a smile of indifference. "I shall follow your advice, not because you give it, but because I had before intended to quit France. I thank you equally for the service you have rendered me in being my seconds. It is deeply engraved on my heart, and, after what you have just said, I remember that only." Château Renaud and Beauchamp looked at each other. The impression was the same on both of them, and the tone in which Morcerf had just expressed his thanks was so determined that the position would have become embarrassing for all if the conversation had continued. "Good bye, Albert," said Beauchamp suddenly, carelessly extending his hand to the young man. The latter did not appear to arouse from his lethargy; in fact, he did not notice the offered hand. "Good bye," said Château Renaud, in his turn, keeping his little cane in his left hand and saluting with his right. Albert's lips scarcely whispered "good bye," but his look was more explicit, It expressed a whole poem of restrained anger, proud disdain, and generous indignation. He preserved his melancholy and motionless position for some time after his two friends had regained their carriage. Then suddenly unfastening his horse from the little tree to which his servant had tied it, he mounted and galloped off in the direction of Paris. In a quarter of an hour he was entering the house in the Rue de Helder. As he alighted, he thought he saw his father's pale face behind the curtain of the count's bedroom. Albert turned away his head with a sigh, and went to his own apartments. He cast one lingering look on all the luxuries which had rendered life so easy and so happy since his infancy. He looked at the pictures, whose faces seemed to smile, and the landscapes, which appeared painted in brighter colors. Then he took away his mother's portrait with its oaken frame, leaving the gilt frame from which he took it black and empty. Then he arranged all his beautiful Turkish arms, his fine English guns, his Japanese china, his cups mounted in silver, his artistic bronzes by Faucheres and Berrier, examined the cupboards, and placed the key in each, threw into a drawer of his secretary, which he left open, all the pocket money he had about him, and with it the 1,000 fancy jewels from his vases and his jewel boxes. Then he made an exact inventory of everything, and placed it in the most conspicuous part of the table, after putting aside the books and papers which had collected there. At the beginning of this work, his servant, notwithstanding orders to the contrary, came to his room. "What do you want?" asked he, with a more sorrowful than angry tone. "Pardon me, sir," replied the valet. "You had forbidden me to disturb you, but the Count of Morcerf has called me." "Well," said Albert. "I did not like to go to him without first seeing you." "Why?" "Because the count is doubtless aware that I accompanied you to the meeting this morning." "It is probable," said Albert. "And since he has sent for me, it is doubtless to question me on what happened there. What must I answer?" "The truth." "Then shall I say the duel did not take place?" "You will say I apologized to the Count of Monte Cristo. Go." The valet bowed and retired, and Albert returned to his inventory. As he was finishing this work, the sound of horses prancing in the yard, and the wheels of a carriage shaking his window, attracted his attention. He approached the window, and saw his father get into it, and drive away. The door was scarcely closed when Albert bent his steps to his mother's room, and no one being there to announce him, he advanced to her bedchamber, and, distressed by what he saw and guessed, stopped for one moment at the door. As if the same idea had animated these two beings, Mercédès was doing the same in her apartments that he had just done in his. Everything was in order: laces, dresses, jewels, linen, money, all were arranged in the drawers, and the countess was carefully collecting the keys. Albert saw all these preparations and understood them, and exclaiming, "My mother!" he threw his arms around her neck. The artist who could have depicted the expression of these two countenances would certainly have made of them a beautiful picture. All these proofs of an energetic resolution, which Albert did not fear on his own account, alarmed him for his mother. "What are you doing?" asked he. "What were you doing?" replied she. "Oh, my mother!" exclaimed Albert, so overcome he could scarcely speak. "It is not the same with you and me. You cannot have made the same resolution I have, for I have come to warn you that I bid adieu to your house, and to you." "I also," replied Mercédès, "am going, and I acknowledge that I had depended on your accompanying me, Have I deceived myself?" "Mother," said Albert with firmness, "I cannot make you share the fate I have planned for myself. I must live henceforth without rank and fortune, and to begin this hard apprenticeship I must borrow from a friend the loaf I shall eat until I have earned one. So, my dear mother, I am going at once to ask France to lend me the small sum I shall require to supply my present wants." "You, my poor child, suffer poverty and hunger? Oh, do not say so, it will break my resolutions." "But not mine, mother," replied Albert. "I am young and strong, I believe I am courageous, and since yesterday I have learned the power of will. Alas, my dear mother, some have suffered so much and yet live, and have raised a new fortune on the ruin of all the promises of happiness which Heaven had made them, on the fragments of all the hope which God had given them. I have seen that, mother. I know that from the gulf in which their enemies have plunged them, they have risen with so much vigor and glory that in their turn they have ruled their former conquerors, and have punished them. No, mother, from this moment I have done with the past, and accept nothing from it, not even a name, because you can understand that your son cannot bear the name of a man who ought to blush for it before another." "Albert, my child," said Mercédès, "if I had a stronger heart, that is the counsel I would have given you. Your conscience has spoken when my voice became too weak. Listen to its dictates. You had friends, Albert, break off their acquaintance, but do not despair, you have life before you, my dear Albert, for you are yet scarcely 22 years old, and as a pure heart like yours wants a spotless name, take my father's, it was Herrera. I am sure, my dear Albert, whatever may be your career, you will soon render that name illustrious. Then, my son, return to the world still more brilliant because of your former sorrows, and if I am wrong, still let me cherish these hopes, for I have no future to look forward to. For me the grave opens when I pass the threshold of this house." "I will fulfill all your wishes, my dear mother," said the young man. "Yes, I share your hopes. The anger of Heaven will not pursue us, since you are pure and I am innocent. But, since our resolution is formed, let us act promptly. Monsieur de Morcerf went out about half an hour ago. The opportunity is favorable to avoid an explanation." "I am ready, my son," said Mercédès. Albert ran to fetch a carriage. He recollected that there was a small furnished house to let in the Rue de Saint Pérez, where his mother would find a humble but decent lodging, and thither he intended conducting the countess. As the carriage stopped at the door, and Albert was alighting, a man approached and gave him a letter. Albert recognized the bearer. "From the count," said Bertuccio. Albert took the letter, opened and read it, then looked round for Bertuccio, but he was gone. He returned to Mercédès with tears in his eyes and heaving breast, and without uttering a word he gave her the letter. Mercédès read: "Albert, while showing you that I have discovered your plans, I hope also to convince you of my delicacy. You are free, you leave the count's house, and you take your mother to your home, but reflect, Albert, you owe her more than your poor noble heart can pay her. Keep the struggle for yourself, bear all the suffering, but spare her the trial of poverty which must accompany your first efforts, for she deserves not even the shadow of the misfortune which has this day fallen on her, and Providence is not willing that the innocent should suffer for the guilty. I know you are going to leave the Rue de Helder without taking anything with you. Do not seek to know how I discovered it. I know it, that is sufficient. Now listen, Albert. 24 years ago I returned, proud and joyful, to my country. I had a betrothed, Albert, a lovely girl whom I adored, and I was bringing to my betrothed 150 louis, painfully amassed by ceaseless toil. This money was for her, I destined it for her, and knowing the treachery of the sea, I buried our treasure in the little garden of the house my father lived in at Marseilles on the Allée de Milan. Your mother, Albert, knows that poor house well. A short time since, I passed through Marseilles, and went to see the old place, which revived so many painful recollections, and in the evening I took a spade and dug in the corner of the garden where I had concealed my treasure. The iron box was there, no one had touched it, under a beautiful fig tree my father had planted the day I was born, which overshadowed the spot. Well, Albert, this money, which was formerly designed to promote the comfort and tranquillity of the woman I adored, may now, through strange and painful circumstances, be devoted to the same purpose. Oh, feel for me, who could offer millions to that poor woman, but who returned her only the piece of black bread forgotten under my poor roof since the day I was torn from her I loved. You are a generous man, Albert, but perhaps you may be blinded by pride or resentment. If you refuse me, if you ask another for what I have a right to offer you, I will say it is ungenerous of you to refuse the life of your mother at the hands of a man whose father was allowed by your father to die in all the horrors of poverty and despair. Albert stood pale and motionless to hear what his mother would decide after she had finished reading this letter. Mercédès turned her eyes with an ineffable look towards heaven. "I accept it," said she. "He has a right to pay the dowry which I shall take with me to some convent." Putting the letter in her bosom, she took her son's arm, and with a firmer step than she even herself expected, she went downstairs. End of chapter 91. Recording by Prachi Pense, Wilmington, Delaware.
The Count of Monte Cristo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Eden Ray Hedrick. The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 92. The Suicide. Meanwhile, Monte Cristo had also returned to the town with Emmanuel and Maximilian. Their return was cheerful. Emmanuel did not conceal his joy at the peaceful termination of the affair, and was loud in his expressions of delight. Morrel, in a corner of the carriage, allowed his brother-in-law's gaiety to expend itself in words, while he felt equal inward joy, which, however, betrayed itself only in his countenance. At the Barrière du Trône they met Bertuccio, who was waiting there, motionless as a sentinel at his post. Monte Cristo put his head out of the window, exchanged a few words with him in a low tone, and the steward disappeared. "Count," said Emmanuel, when they were at the end of the Place Royale, "put me down at my door, that my wife may not have a single moment of needless anxiety on my account or yours. If it were not ridiculous to make a display of our triumph, I would invite the count to our house. Besides that, he has doubtless some trembling heart to comfort, so we will have to take leave of our friend and let him hasten home." "Stop a moment," said Monte Cristo; "do not let me lose both my companions. Return, Emmanuel, to your charming wife, and present my best compliments to her; and do you, Morrel, accompany me to the Champs-Élysées." "Willingly," said Maximilian, "particularly as I have business in that quarter." "Shall we wait breakfast for you?" asked Emmanuel. "No," replied the young man. The door was closed, and the carriage proceeded. "See what good fortune I brought you," said Morrel when he was alone with the count. "Have you not thought so?" "Yes," said Monte Cristo; "for that reason I wished to keep you near me." "It is miraculous. continued Morrel, answering his own thoughts. "What?" said Monte Cristo. "What has just happened." "Yes," said the count, "you are right; it is miraculous." "For Albert is brave," resumed Morrel. "Very brave," said Monte Cristo. "I have seen him sleep with a sword suspended over his head." "And I know he has fought 2 duels," said Morrel. "How can you reconcile that with his conduct this morning?" "All owing to your influence," replied Monte Cristo, smiling. "It is well for Albert that he is not in the army," said Morrel. "Why?" "An apology on the ground," said the young captain, shaking his head. "Come," said the count mildly, "do not entertain the prejudices of ordinary men, Morrel. Acknowledge that, if Albert is brave, he cannot be a coward. He must then have had some reason for acting as he did this morning, and confess that his conduct is more heroic than otherwise." "Doubtless, doubtless," said Morrel; "but I shall say, like the Spaniard, he has not been so brave today as he was yesterday." "You will breakfast with me, will you not, Morrel?" said the count, to turn the conversation. "No, I must leave you at 10 o'clock." "Your engagement was for breakfast, then?" said the count. Morrel smiled and shook his head. "Still, you must breakfast somewhere." "But if I am not hungry?" said the young man. "Oh," said the count, "I only know 2 things which destroy the appetite: grief, and as I am happy to see you very cheerful, it is not that, and love. Now, after what you have told me this morning of your heart, I may believe—" "Well, count," replied Morrel gayly, "I will not dispute it." "But will you not make me your confidant, Maximilian?" said the count, in a tone which showed how gladly he would have been admitted to the secret. "I showed you this morning that I had a heart, did I not, count?" Monte Cristo only answered by extending his hand to the young man. "Well," continued the latter, "since that heart is no longer with you in the Bois de Vincennes, it is elsewhere, and I must go and find it." "Go," said the count deliberately, "go, dear friend, but promise me that if you meet with any obstacle, to remember that I have some power in this world, that I am happy to use that power on the behalf of those I love, and that I love you, Morrel." "I will remember it," said the young man, "as selfish children recollect their parents when they want their aid. When I need your assistance and the moment arrives, I will come to you, count." "Well, I rely upon your promise. Goodbye, then." "Goodbye, till we meet again." They had arrived in the Champs Élysées. Monte Cristo opened the carriage door. Morrel sprang out on the pavement. Bertuccio was waiting on the steps. Morrel disappeared down the Avenue de Marigny, and Monte Cristo hastened to join Bertuccio. "Well?" asked he. "She is going to leave her house," said the steward. "And her son?" "Florentin, his valet, thinks he is going to do the same." "Come this way." Monte Cristo took Bertuccio into his study, wrote the letter we have seen, and gave it to the steward. "Go," he said quickly; "but first let Haydée be informed that I have returned." "Here I am," said the young girl, who, at the sound of the carriage, had run downstairs, and whose face was radiant with joy at seeing the count return safely. Bertuccio left. Every transport of a daughter finding a father, all the delight of a mistress seeing an adored lover, were felt by Haydée during the first moments of this meeting, which she had so eagerly expected. Doubtless, although less evident, Monte Cristo's joy was not less intense. Joy to hearts which have suffered long is like dew on the ground after a long drought; both the heart and the ground absorb that beneficent moisture falling on them, and nothing is outwardly apparent. Monte Cristo was beginning to think, what he had not for a long time dared to believe, that there were 2 Mercédès in the world, and he might yet be happy. His eye, elate with happiness, was reading eagerly the tearful gaze of Haydée, when suddenly the door opened. The count knit his brow. "Monsieur de Morcerf," said Baptistin, as if the name sufficed for his excuse. In fact, the count's face brightened. "Which?" asked he, "the viscount or the count?" "The count." "Oh," exclaimed Haydée, "is it not yet over?"
"I know not if it is finished, my beloved child," said Monte Cristo, taking the young girl's hands; "but I do know you have nothing more to fear."
"But it is the wretched—"
"That man cannot injure me, Haydée," said Monte Cristo. "It was his son alone that there was cause to fear."
"And what I have suffered," said the young girl, "you shall never know, my lord." Monte Cristo smiled.
"By my father's tomb," said he, extending his hand over the head of the young girl, "I swear to you, Haydée, that if any misfortune happens, it will not be to me."
"I believe you, my lord, as implicitly as if God had spoken to me," said the young girl, presenting her forehead to him. Monte Cristo pressed on that pure, beautiful forehead a kiss which made two hearts throb at once, the one violently, the other heavily. "Oh," murmured the count, "shall I then be permitted to love again? Ask M. de Morcerf into the drawing room," said he to Baptistin, while he led the beautiful Greek girl to a private staircase. We must explain this visit, which, although expected by Monte Cristo, is unexpected to our readers. While Mercédès, as we have said, was making a similar inventory of her property to Albert's, while she was arranging her jewels, shutting her drawers, collecting her keys, to leave everything in perfect order, she did not perceive a pale and sinister face at a glass door which threw light into the passage, from which everything could both be seen and heard. He who was thus looking, without being heard or seen, probably heard and saw all that passed in Madame de Morcerf's apartments. From that glass door the pale-faced man went to the count's bedroom, and raised with a constricted hand the curtain of a window overlooking the courtyard. He remained there 10 minutes, motionless and dumb, listening to the beating of his own heart. For him, those 10 minutes were very long. It was then Albert, returning from his meeting with the count, perceived his father watching for his arrival behind a curtain, and turned aside. The count's eye expanded. He knew Albert had insulted the count dreadfully, and that in every country in the world such an insult would lead to a deadly duel. Albert returned safely, then the count was revenged. An indescribable ray of joy illumined that wretched countenance like the last ray of the sun before it disappears behind the clouds which bear the aspect, not of a downy couch, but of a tomb. But as we have said, he waited in vain for his son to come to his apartment with the account of his triumph. He easily understood why his son did not come to see him before he went to avenge his father's honor. But when that was done, why did not his son come and throw himself into his arms? It was then, when the count could not see Albert, that he sent for his servant, who he knew was authorized not to conceal anything from him. 10 minutes afterward, General Morcerf was seen on the steps, in a black coat with a military collar, black pantaloons, and black gloves. He had apparently given previous orders, for as he reached the bottom step, his carriage came from the coach-house, ready for him. The valet threw into the carriage his military cloak, in which 2 swords were wrapped, and, shutting the door, he took his seat by the side of the coachman. The coachman stooped down for his orders. "To the Champs-Élysées," said the general, "the Count of Monte Cristo's. Hurry!" The horses bounded beneath the whip, and in 5 minutes they stood before the count's door. M. de Morcerf opened the door himself, and as the carriage rolled away, he passed up the walk, rang, and entered the open door with his servant. A moment afterwards, Baptistin announced the Count of Morcerf to Monte Cristo, and the latter, leading Haydée aside, ordered that Morcerf be asked into the drawing room. The general was pacing the room the 3rd time when, in turning, he perceived Monte Cristo at the door. "Ah, it is M. de Morcerf," said Monte Cristo quietly. "I thought I had not heard aright." "Yes, it is I," said the count, whom a frightful contraction of the lips prevented from articulating freely. "May I know the cause which procures me the pleasure of seeing M. de Morcerf so early?" "Had you not a meeting with my son this morning?" asked the general. "I had," replied the count. "And I know that my son had good reason to wish to fight with you, and to endeavor to kill you." "Yes, sir, he had very good ones; but you see that in spite of them he has not killed me, and did not even fight." "Yet he considered you the cause of his father's dishonor, the cause of the fearful ruin which has fallen on my house." "It is true, sir," said Monte Cristo with his dreadful calmness, "a secondary cause, but not the principal." "Doubtless you made, then, some apology or explanation." "I explained nothing, and it was he who apologized to me." "But to what do you attribute this conduct?" "To the conviction, probably, that there was one more guilty than I." "And who was that?" "His father." "That may be," said the count, turning pale, "but you know the guilty do not like to find themselves convicted." "I know it, and I expected this result." "You expected my son would be a coward?" cried the count. "Monsieur Albert de Morcerf is no coward," said Monte Cristo. "A man who holds a sword in his hand and sees a mortal enemy within reach of that sword, and does not fight, is a coward. Why is he not here that I may tell him so?" "Sir," replied Monte Cristo coldly, "I did not expect that you had come here to relate to me your little family affairs. Go and tell Monsieur Albert that, and he may know what to answer you." "Oh, no, no," said the general, smiling faintly. "I did not come for that purpose. You are right. I came to tell you that I also look upon you as my enemy. I came to tell you that I hate you instinctively, that it seems as if I have always known you and always hated you, and in short, since the young people of the present day will not fight, it remains for us to do so. Do you think so, sir?" "Certainly. And when I told you I had foreseen this result, it is the honor of your visit I alluded to." "So much the better. Are you prepared?" "Yes, sir." "You know that we shall fight till one of us is dead," said the general, whose teeth were clenched with rage. "Until one of us dies," repeated Monte Cristo, moving his head slightly up and down. "Let us start then. We need no witnesses." "Very true," said Monte Cristo. "It is unnecessary. We know each other so well." "On the contrary," said the count, "we know so little of each other." "Indeed," said Monte Cristo with the same indomitable coolness. "Let us see. Are you not the soldier Fernand, who deserted on the eve of the battle of Waterloo? Are you not the Lieutenant Fernand who served as a guide and a spy to the French army in Spain? Are you not the Captain Fernand who betrayed, sold, and murdered his benefactor Ali? And have not all these Fernands, united, made Lieutenant General the Count of Morcerf, peer of France?" "Oh," cried the general, as if branded with a hot iron, "wretch, to reproach me with my shame, when about perhaps to kill me! No, I did not say I was a stranger to you. I know well, demon, that you have penetrated into the darkness of the past, and that you have read, by the light of what torch I know not, every page of my life. But perhaps I may be more honorable in my shame than you under your pompous coverings. No, no, I am aware that you know me, but I know you only as an adventurer sewn up in gold and jewelry. You call yourself in Paris the Count of Monte Cristo, in Italy Sinbad the Sailor, in Malta I forget what. But it is your real name I want to know, in the midst of your 100 names, that I may pronounce it when we meet to fight, at the moment when I plunge my sword through your heart." The Count of Monte Cristo turned dreadfully pale. His eyes seemed to burn with a devouring fire. He leapt towards a dressing room near his bedroom, and in less than a moment, tearing off his cravat, his coat and waistcoat, he put on a sailor's jacket and hat, from beneath which rolled his long black hair. He returned thus, formidable and implacable, advancing with his arms crossed on his breast, toward the general, who could not understand why he had disappeared, but who, on seeing him again, and feeling his teeth chatter and his legs sink under him, drew back, and only stopped when he found a table to support his clenched hand. "Fernand," cried he, "of my 100 names I need only tell you one to overwhelm you. But you guess it now, do you not? Or rather, you remember it. For, notwithstanding all my sorrows and my tortures, I show you today a face which the happiness of revenge makes young again, a face you must often have seen in your dreams since your marriage with Mercédès, my betrothed." The general, with his head thrown back, hands extended, gaze fixed, looked silently at this dreadful apparition; then, seeking the wall to support him, he glided along close to it until he reached the door, through which he went out backwards, uttering the single, mournful, lamentable, distressing cry, "Edmond Dantès!" Then, with sighs which were unlike any human sound, he dragged himself to the door, reeled across the courtyard, and, falling into the arms of his valet, he said in a voice scarcely intelligible, "Home, home." The fresh air and the shame he felt at having exposed himself before his servants partly recalled his senses, but the ride was short, and as he drew near his house all his wretchedness revived. He stopped at a short distance from the house and alighted. The door was wide open. A hackney coach was standing in the middle of the yard, a strange sight before so noble a mansion. The count looked at it with terror, but without daring to inquire its meaning. He rushed towards his apartment. Two persons were coming down the stairs. He had only time to creep into an alcove to avoid them. It was Mercédès, leaning on her son's arm and leaving the house. They passed close by the unhappy being who, concealed behind the damask curtain, almost felt Mercédès' dress brush past him, and his son's warm breath, pronouncing these words, "Courage, mother, come, this is no longer our home." The words died away, the steps were lost in the distance. The general drew himself up, clinging to the curtain. He uttered the most dreadful sob which ever escaped from the bosom of a father abandoned at the same time by his wife and son. He soon heard the clatter of the iron step of the hackney coach, then the coachman's voice, and then the rolling of the heavy vehicle shook the windows. He darted to his bedroom to see once more all he had loved in the world, but the hackney coach drove on, and the head of neither Mercédès nor her son appeared at the window to take a last look at the house or the deserted father and husband. And at the very moment when the wheels of that coach crossed the gateway, a report was heard, and a thick smoke escaped through one of the panes of the window, which was broken by the explosion. Chapter 92.
93 of the Count of Monte Cristo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 93. Valentine. We may easily conceive where Morrel's appointment was. On leaving Monte Cristo he walked slowly towards Villefort's. We say slowly, for Morrel had more than half an hour to spare to go 500 steps, but he had hastened to take leave of Monte Cristo because he wished to be alone with his thoughts. He knew his time well, the hour when Valentine was giving Noirtier his breakfast, and was sure not to be disturbed in the performance of this pious duty. Noirtier and Valentine had given him leave to go twice a week, and he was now availing himself of that permission. He had arrived. Valentine was expecting him. Uneasy and almost crazed, she seized his hand and led him to her grandfather. This uneasiness, amounting almost to frenzy, arose from the report Morcerf's adventure had made in the world, for the affair at the opera was generally known. No one at Villefort's doubted that a duel would ensue from it. Valentine, with her woman's instinct, guessed that Morrel would be Monte Cristo's second, and from the young man's well-known courage and his great affection for the count, she feared that he would not content himself with the passive part assigned to him. We may easily understand how eagerly the particulars were asked for, given, and received, and Morrel could read an indescribable joy in the eyes of his beloved when she knew that the termination of this affair was as happy as it was unexpected. "Now," said Valentine, motioning to Morrel to sit down near her grandfather, while she took her seat on his footstool, "now let us talk about our own affairs. You know, Maximilian, grandpapa once thought of leaving this house, and taking an apartment away from M. de Villefort's." "Yes," said Maximilian, "I recollect the project, of which I highly approved." "Well," said Valentine, "you may approve again, for grandpapa is again thinking of it."
"Bravo!"
said Maximilian. "And do you know," said Valentine, "what reason grandpapa gives for leaving this house?" Noirtier looked at Valentine to impose silence, but she did not notice him. Her looks, her eyes, her smile were all for Morrel. "Oh, whatever may be M. Noirtier's reason," answered Morrel, "I can readily believe it to be a good one." "An excellent one," said Valentine. "He pretends the air of the Faubourg Saint Honoré is not good for me." "Indeed," said Morrel, "in that M. Noirtier may be right. You have not seemed to be well for the last fortnight." "Not very," said Valentine, "and grandpapa has become my physician, and I have the greatest confidence in him, because he knows everything." "Do you, then, really suffer?" asked Morrel quickly. "Oh, it must not be called suffering. I feel a general uneasiness, that is all. I have lost my appetite, and my stomach feels as if it were struggling to get accustomed to something." Noirtier did not lose a word of what Valentine said. "And what treatment do you adopt for this singular complaint?" "A very simple one," said Valentine. "I swallow every morning a spoonful of the mixture prepared for my grandfather. When I say 1 spoonful, I began by 1, now I take 4. Grandpapa says it is a panacea." Valentine smiled, but it was evident that she suffered. Maximilian, in his devotedness, gazed silently at her. She was very beautiful, but her usual pallor had increased, her eyes were more brilliant than ever, and her hands, which were generally white like mother of pearl, now more resembled wax, to which time was adding a yellowish hue. From Valentine, the young man looked towards Noirtier. The latter watched with strange and deep interest the young girl, absorbed by her affection, but he also, like Morrel, followed those traces of inward suffering which was so little perceptible to a common observer that they escaped the notice of every one but the grandfather and the lover. "But," said Morrel, "I thought this mixture, of which you now take 4 spoonfuls, was prepared for Monsieur Noirtier." "I know it is very bitter," said Valentine, "so bitter that all I drink afterwards appears to have the same taste." Noirtier looked inquiringly at his granddaughter. "Yes, grandpapa," said Valentine, "it is so. Just now, before I came down to you, I drank a glass of sugared water. I left half, because it seemed so bitter." Noirtier turned pale, and made a sign that he wished to speak. Valentine rose to fetch the dictionary. Noirtier watched her with evident anguish. In fact, the blood was rushing to the young girl's head already. Her cheeks were becoming red. "Oh," cried she, without losing any of her cheerfulness, "this is singular. I can't see. Did the sun shine in my eyes?" And she leaned against the window. "The sun is not shining," said Morrel, more alarmed by Noirtier's expression than by Valentine's indisposition. He ran towards her. The young girl smiled. "Cheer up," said she to Noirtier. "Do not be alarmed, Maximilian. It is nothing, and has already passed away. But listen, do I not hear a carriage in the courtyard?" She opened Noirtier's door, ran to a window in the passage, and returned hastily. "Yes," said she, "it is Madame Danglars and her daughter, who have come to call on us. Good bye, I must run away, for they would send here for me, or rather, farewell till I see you again. Stay with grandpapa, Maximilian. I promise you not to persuade them to stay." Morrel watched her as she left the room. He heard her ascend the little staircase which led both to Madame de Villefort's apartments and to hers. As soon as she was gone, Noirtier made a sign to Morrel to take the dictionary. Morrel obeyed. Guided by Valentine, he had learned how to understand the old man quickly. Accustomed, however, as he was to the work, he had to repeat most of the letters of the alphabet, and to find every word in the dictionary, so that it was 10 minutes before the thought of the old man was translated by these words: "Fetch the glass of water and the decanter from Valentine's room." Morrel rang immediately for the servant who had taken Barrois's situation, and in Noirtier's name gave that order. The servant soon returned. The decanter and the glass were completely empty. Noirtier made a sign that he wished to speak. "Why are the glass and decanter empty?" asked he. "Valentine said she only drank half the glassful." The translation of this new question occupied another 5 minutes. "I do not know," said the servant, "but the housemaid is in Mademoiselle Valentine's room; perhaps she has emptied them." "Ask her," said Morrel, translating Noirtier's thought this time by his look. The servant went out, but returned almost immediately. "Mademoiselle Valentine passed through the room to go to Madame de Villefort's," said he, "and, in passing, as she was thirsty, she drank what remained in the glass. As for the decanter, Master Edward had emptied that to make a pond for his ducks." Noirtier raised his eyes to heaven, as a gambler does who stakes his all on one stroke. From that moment, the old man's eyes were fixed on the door, and did not quit it. It was indeed Madame Danglars and her daughter whom Valentine had seen. They had been ushered into Madame de Villefort's room, who had said she would receive them there. That is why Valentine passed through her room, which was on a level with Valentine's, and only separated from it by Edward's. The two ladies entered the drawing room with that sort of official stiffness which precludes a formal communication. Among worldly people manner is contagious. Madame de Villefort received them with equal solemnity. Valentine entered at this moment, and the formalities were resumed. "My dear friend," said the baroness, while the two young people were shaking hands, "I and Eugénie are come to be the first to announce to you the approaching marriage of my daughter with Prince Cavalcanti." Danglars kept up the title of prince. The popular banker found that it answered better than count. "Allow me to present you my sincere congratulations," replied Madame de Villefort. "Prince Cavalcanti appears to be a young man of rare qualities." "Listen," said the baroness, smiling. "Speaking to you as a friend, I can say that the prince does not yet appear all he will be. He has about him a little of that foreign manner by which French persons recognize, at first sight, the Italian or German nobleman. Besides, he gives evidence of great kindness of disposition, much keenness of wit, and as to suitability, M. Danglars assures me that his fortune is majestic, that is his word." "And then," said Eugénie, while turning over the leaves of Madame de Villefort's album, "add that you have taken a great fancy to the young man." "And," said Madame de Villefort, "I need not ask you if you share that fancy." "I?" replied Eugénie, with her usual candor. "Oh, not the least in the world, madame. My wish was not to confine myself to domestic cares or the caprices of any man, but to be an artist, and consequently free in heart, in person, and in thought." Eugénie pronounced these words with so firm a tone that the color mounted to Valentine's cheeks. The timid girl could not understand that vigorous nature which appeared to have none of the timidities of woman. "At any rate," said she, "since I am to be married whether I will or not, I ought to be thankful to Providence for having released me from my engagement with Monsieur Albert de Morcerf, or I should this day have been the wife of a dishonored man." "It is true," said the baroness, with that strange simplicity sometimes met with among fashionable ladies, and of which plebeian intercourse can never entirely deprive them. "It is very true that had not the Morcerfs hesitated, my daughter would have married Monsieur Albert. The general depended much on it; he even came to force M. Danglars. We have had a narrow escape." "But," said Valentine, timidly, "does all the father's shame revert upon the son? Monsieur Albert appears to me quite innocent of the treason charged against the general." "Excuse me," said the implacable young girl. "Monsieur Albert claims and well deserves his share. It appears that after having challenged M. de Monte Cristo at the Opera yesterday, he apologized on the ground today." "Impossible!" said Madame de Villefort. "Ah, my dear friend," said Madame Danglars, with the same simplicity we before noticed, "it is a fact. I heard it from M. Debray, who was present at the explanation." Valentine also knew the truth, but she did not answer. A single word had reminded her that Morrel was expecting her in M. Noirtier's room. Deeply engaged, with a sort of inward contemplation, Valentine had ceased for a moment to join in the conversation. She would, indeed, have found it impossible to repeat what had been said in the last few minutes, when suddenly Madame Danglars' hand, pressed on her arm, aroused her from her lethargy. "What is it?" said she, starting at Madame Danglars' touch as she would have done from an electric shock. "It is, my dear Valentine," said the baroness, "that you are doubtless suffering." "I?" said the young girl, passing her hand across her burning forehead. "Yes, look at yourself in that glass; you have turned pale and then red successively, 3 or 4 times in 1 minute." "Indeed," cried Eugénie, "you are very pale." "Oh, do not be alarmed, I have been so for many days." Artless as she was, the young girl knew that this was an opportunity to leave, and besides, Madame de Villefort came to her assistance. "Retire, Valentine," said she. "You are really suffering, and these ladies will excuse you. Drink a glass of pure water, it will restore you." Valentine kissed Eugénie, bowed to Madame Danglars, who had already risen to take her leave, and went out. "That poor child," said Madame de Villefort, when Valentine was gone, "she makes me very uneasy, and I should not be astonished if she had some serious illness." Meanwhile, Valentine, in a sort of excitement which she could not understand, had crossed Edward's room without noticing some trick of the child, and through her own had reached the little staircase. She was within 3 steps of the bottom. She already heard Morrel's voice, when suddenly a cloud passed over her eyes, her stiffened foot missed the step, her hands had no power to hold the baluster, and falling against the wall, she lost her balance wholly and toppled to the floor. Morrel bounded to the door, opened it, and found Valentine stretched out at the bottom of the stairs. Quick as a flash, he raised her in his arms and placed her in a chair. Valentine opened her eyes. "Oh, what a clumsy thing I am!" said she with feverish volubility. "I don't know my way. I forgot there were 3 more steps before the landing." "You have hurt yourself, perhaps," said Morrel. "What can I do for you, Valentine?" Valentine looked around her. She saw the deepest terror depicted in Noirtier's eyes. "Don't worry, dear grandpapa," said she, endeavoring to smile. "It is nothing, it is nothing. I was giddy, that is all." "Another attack of giddiness?" said Morrel, clasping his hands. "Oh, attend to it, Valentine, I entreat you." "But no," said Valentine, "no, I tell you it is all past, and it was nothing. Now let me tell you some news. Eugénie is to be married in a week, and in 3 days there is to be a grand feast, a betrothal festival. We are all invited, my father, Madame de Villefort, and I; at least, I understood it so. When will it be our turn to think of these things? Oh, Valentine, you who have so much influence over your grandpapa, try to make him answer soon." "And do you," said Valentine, "depend on me to stimulate the tardiness and arouse the memory of grandpapa?" "Yes," cried Morrel, "make haste. So long as you are not mine, Valentine, I shall always think I may lose you." "Oh," replied Valentine with convulsive movement, "oh, indeed, Maximilian, you are too timid for an officer, for a soldier who, they say, never knows fear. Ah, ha, ha!" She burst into a forced and melancholy laugh. Her arms stiffened and twisted, her head fell back on her chair, and she remained motionless. The cry of terror which was stopped on Noirtier's lips seemed to start from his eyes. Morrel understood it; he knew he must call assistance. The young man rang the bell violently. The housemaid who had been in Mademoiselle Valentine's room, and the servant who had replaced Barrois, ran in at the same moment. Valentine was so pale, so cold, so inanimate, that without listening to what was said to them, they were seized with the fear which pervaded that house, and they flew into the passage crying for help. Madame Danglars and Eugénie were going out at that moment. They heard the cause of the disturbance. "I told you so," exclaimed Madame de Villefort. "Poor child!" Chapter 93. Recording by Prachi Pense, Wilmington, Delaware.